I'm Amber Schoon. Thank you to my students and my family and my neighbors. And this is Isabel, my daughter, and she's with me today, which is fitting because all of this work has been made since Izzy was born. The exhibition is called The Library, and I've prepared a pretty brief text to tell you about the idea of the library, and then I will sort of open it up to questions and we can talk about individual pieces. This library is largely inspired by a library at the American Academy in Rome, which I visited about 2 years ago. And it's called the Arthur and Janet C. Ross Library. And the library was, first of all, an incredible architectural space. So it was a space that felt energetic and exciting and calming and welcoming, just a really beautiful, visually, aesthetically pleasing place to be, with natural light, and everything is made out of wood and really old, gorgeous, polished wood, and there are tables everywhere that anybody can sit at, which just seems like normal for a library, but they're sort of individual tables and anybody could sort of claim one. So you have your own little nook in the library. And the library is also special because it has books, but it also has collections of drawings and collections of portfolios. And they also had rare books. And these were the kind of books that the librarians tell me, in theory, you should only touch them with gloves. But the library was so intended to be an active place of research that they let anybody touch them. So you can touch these beautiful old objects and bring them with you and sit down with them and look at them. So this was really amazing. And the other thing that was amazing about the library is that I was there with Izzy. She was 10 months old and she needed all my time. So I pretty much only went to the library when she was asleep. She's a night owl, so that was like between midnight and 6 in the morning I would go to the library. It was open 24 hours a day. So it was really like a magical space for me, and it was kind of coming out of this 10 months of intensive Izzy time, and suddenly I was in Rome and I was in this beautiful library. I could touch anything I wanted. So that was all amazing. And the other thing that was really cool was that they had a system that they've now changed, but when you find your object, your book, your collection of prints, you would have like kind of piece of cardstock and you'd write your name on it and you would sort of write where your desk is. So some people like do a little drawing, some people are writing like second floor, third window, and you write your name and you stick it in there. And so if somebody else came to the library and they said, I really want that book on Caravaggio, they would go there, they'd find this little piece of paper and it would say, Amber Schoon has a Caravaggio book downstairs in the basement, third desk. And so they could go there and take the book, use it, and bring it back to your desk. So there's like an element of trust, and also this beautiful collaborative activity, because as you walk through the library, you'd see this person has this stack of books, and this person has this stack of drawings, and you're kind of seeing by way of their research interests who that person was and what they were interested in. So the other thing that's important about this library is you can't take anything out of it. So it's not a lending library where you go and check out your book and take it home. It has to stay in the library. So all the research is done in the library. People were drawing in the library. People were reading. People have their computers and their notebooks. They're journaling. And I should mention that the American Academy in Rome is a place where people are coming from all over the world to do research in arts and architecture and design and philosophy and literature. So it's this really beautiful place where the arts, and for me particularly philosophy, are coming together at once. So you see this collaborative feeling in the library and you see it on everybody's desk. So this was really beautiful and I was really inspired by that. So I got to thinking, what if an art exhibition was like this library space? In that everything could be touched and everything was not simply to be looked at but to be used for further research and inspiration. And nothing would leave the gallery and nothing would be sold, right? Which is also a difference between a public library and a commercial exhibition space. So I've always loved the idea of a public library, and the library as a collection of information reaches basically as far back as the written word. There's all kinds of evidence of libraries that contained cuneiform tablets, writing on clay, writing on stone, But mostly the idea of a public library came alive in the Age of Enlightenment. So a library that was not specifically designed just for scholars or just for architects or just for the collection of documents of commercial trade, but an idea that there could be a public space that the entire community could access in order to better themselves, enrich their lives, was really an Enlightenment idea. So we're talking about 1700s or so. I became really excited about this idea of the library, and then John Berger wrote me a letter. John Berger is a drawer and a novelist, a poet, an art critic, philosopher, who recently passed at the age of 90, who famously wrote Ways of Seeing. So if any of you guys are art students, you'll probably at some point come into contact with this text called Ways of Seeing. And he sort of looked at art history in relation to capitalism and philosophy, and how we could approach art in a more authentic way. That's my words, not John Berger. John Berger wrote me a letter in which he spoke at length about swimming in a public pool. And he had back pain in the end of his life, and he swam every day. And he loved his public swimming pool. And he wrote about the idea that in Paris, where he was living at the time, public spaces were becoming harder and harder to find. That the space of the city was being bought up and divided by individuals and commercial real estate and companies and places that would basically say only certain people can come into this place. So the idea of the Italian piazza, which is also very dear to my heart, where the whole community kind of comes and hangs out, which is evident in public libraries, John Berger was finding in the pool. And he was really upset about the loss of these kinds of public spaces. And then he talked specifically about this idea of people being kind of forced to meet each other who would not otherwise talk to each other. And I often think about the subway in New York City, or like a bus that goes smack down Broadway, when all different sorts of people get on that public transportation. And it's one of the most beautiful experiences for me to have people of different languages and different creeds and different walks of life all kind of smushed together. And that was what John Berger loved about his pool. So in 2009, I went to visit John Berger, and we had this wonderful conversation at his house. And one of the most important things he told me was, make your art community out of the people that you really care about, instead of out of the people that you assume care about art. Does that make sense? Which seemed like common sense, but coming from my New York City art education, that was like insanity, right? And so at that point, it had been drilled into my head that you need to have big exhibitions in New York City, and that's your goal, and you should be happy about that. And somehow it's very unsatisfying. And John Berger became a mentor for me in many things, but specifically in my own career and how I could go forth in a more satisfying way. So I began to think about exhibiting in libraries, and I did that in New York City, and I did that in Sevastopol, which is in Crimea, which is in the Ukraine/Russia, depending on who is talking about it. And that was really interesting to have my work in libraries. But it was a library space that functioned like a library with artwork on the walls. So the artwork was decoration for the activity of being in the library. So once I was in the library at the American Academy in Rome, where people were both drawing and writing, reading philosophy and reading history and looking at art all in the same place, I began to think, what if my art exhibition was itself a library and the artworks were the library's collection? So that was the genesis for the idea of this show. All right, so that's the idea of the library, and then there's two other ideas that I wrote about, and then we'll talk about individual pieces. The library kind of contains all the work. It helped me kind of move forward when I was really getting stuck thinking about the dissatisfaction with exhibiting, thinking about the artwork being something that people could touch, like these books, could study, could do research from, and also could draw from. And in my own studio, my books, and I brought some of my most important books in this little bookshelf. In my own studio, my books also became art objects that I was often drawing, and my art objects, my drawings, became things that I was often writing about. So that mixture was happening in my studio as well. And a big kind of shift, I think, in here is that I would like you all to actually touch the pieces, which I know is like a big hurdle in the art world because we're so taught not to touch the pieces. But I love the idea, and I don't know how long it will take to get there, for the audience to actually be in a space where you can sit comfortably, where you can have a desk. I would like there to be like a big, huge, comfortable wooden desk that I don't own yet, but someday, you know, like a 8-foot by 8-foot desk, everyone can kind of plop their stuff down. And I like the idea of people actually like taking things off the wall and touching them and them changing like that. And then the other idea that happened with a library is that the objects in the library don't get sold. They don't disappear, right? If you had a beautiful public library and then you sold half of it, that would be like a really bad library, right? So as a librarian of my own library, I want to keep these things and I want to share them. And it also changed the way I think about finishing things, because I realized that usually when I had an exhibition, the work basically got exhibited when it arrived at a place of looking good enough to exhibit. And if the work stayed in my studio, I would continue to work on it. And if it left the studio, so be it. But there was never a point where I thought, I'm absolutely done with that, I don't need to look at it, I'm not interested in it, I don't need to touch it anymore. It was always leaving my studio in an artificial manner. So, for instance, some of these pieces were exhibited in Birmingham, Alabama last year. And you might recognize it. You might say, oh yeah, I saw that in Birmingham, but it has changed. So knowing that I was keeping these works for this exhibition, I continue to work with them and write about them, physically change them, draw them, et cetera, et cetera. So that is really exciting to me. And I often think about Alberto Giacometti, who is a painter and sculptor who famously was making surrealist sculpture and decided that he didn't really know, he was a little bit stuck, and he took a model into his studio and he thought, hey, I'll just draw from the model for like a couple days. And he said something like, you know, a week later, you guys will get, those of you who know the quote tell me, a week later or 2 weeks later, it seemed like the distance across the bridge of her nose was like the Sahara. In other words, the process of looking and seeing was absolutely infinite and endless. It wasn't going to be a project that was going to take a couple days or a couple months or even a year. It was going to take his whole life. And famously, when people took paintings out of his studio, it was against his will. So I kind of feel like that, except I don't want to fight with curators. I just keep them as part of my library and continue working on them until I actually feel finished, which I think probably will never happen. And the other thing, there's one last point that I make in this little text, which is that about 4 or 5 years ago now, I published my first book, which is called Quantum Art. And one of the major questions of the book, which still affects my studio art practice, is the question of if mimesis, which is the Greek word for copying, okay? And I just use that word to differentiate between our common conception of copying and all of the research that I do around copying. So if mimesis is actually a generative activity, in other words, when I look at something, I am also creating it, which has its inspiration in the roots of quantum physics. If that's happening, which I take to be a serious possibility, when I look at an activity of violence or a negative event, and I observe it, and I see it in my mind, and I make it on the paper, either in writing or in drawing or in painting or in sculpture, I am creating that activity of violence for myself and in my life. This is a question in my mind. And especially since having my daughter, I really took this responsibility seriously. What if I only look at negative events in my life? And unfortunately, I've seen a lot of serious violence. And so it's in my mind. So if I'm to make artworks which reflect on this violence, am I not creating that violence in my own body and in my own life and for my daughter? And I believe that that's possible. And so I made a really active effort in making this library to collect not only a reflection of negative events, which are important, but also a reflection of beautiful events, and also a collection of exciting ideas, things I've imagined, and homes. So it is not simply a reflection of my past, but also what I'm imagining of my future, and not simply a collection of big, important events, but also kind of mundane ones that have hung around with me. And so all of that is what comprises the library. It's what the collection is made up of. And then lastly, the library is important because it is a collection of the objects that I need in order to make my next project. The next project, of course, is wide open and imaginative, and I've written about it so many times and it's changed so many times. But in some senses, I'm writing a novel. In some senses, I'm making the objects that will comprise a chapter of the novel, and in some senses, they're connecting. So the library is a collection of objects that I will need to pull from in order to create my next project. That's the easiest way to say it, which will in some senses be a novel. And then my very last thought, and then I can take questions and we can talk about individual pieces, is that growing up, my particular art education, which mostly took place in New York City and then in Italy, the New York part of it was, I would say, very conservative, even though the artists would never call themselves conservative, because artists are progressive and open-minded and yada, yada, yada. But in fact, there were so many rules. And those rules were really ingrained in my mind. And one of them was never be illustrative. Any art students in the audience have heard this rule? Yeah, illustration, oh my goodness, you might as well jump off a cliff. And with that came narrative, dangerous thing. That was really not totally allowed in my young education. And then there was also a huge break between philosophy and studio arts. So I was told, are you going to be a philosopher or are you going to be a painter? Make up your mind in a not so nice way. And so that also is beginning to unravel itself, and especially with help from John Berger, who was himself a drawer to begin with, and who taught drawing for 10 years and moved from drawing into philosophy, and moved into philosophy by way of drawing, and always came back to it. So even though you may not know John Berger as a drawer, because he wasn't particularly interested in exhibiting, when he was writing, he was also drawing. When he was thinking, he was also drawing. And he took those drawings really seriously. So I'm attempting to allow myself to let these stories come out, to let these imaginative, kind of wild, when I was a kid, I wrote these wild sci-fi stories with me and my best friend Jocelyn and all the crazy things, and Anya and all my childhood friends, you know. And I also wrote a lot of stories and connected them with objects and drawings. And that was really like torn apart as a student. Not torn apart because I still had it, but it was very pushed aside. So that's one of the things that's kind of coming back in the library, is this idea of collecting stories and all the different ways we can tell stories. And Izzy has touched every single piece in here. And that probably helped me get past that fear of touching art, right? Because I'm not going to not make art, and I'm not going to not be with her. And so she has touched / helped / drawn on / sewed everything here. Yep. So, and I liked it. I liked the change. One of my most dear professors came to see my studio a couple weeks ago. She said, if people touch these things, they're going to leave fingerprints, they're going to leave marks, they're going to change them. Are you really ready for that? And I said, yes, please. You know, I love that idea. Things are low and high on purpose so that little people can touch them. So there's nothing dangerous. So I think that's all of my major points about what the library is. Would you all like to actually get up, touch things, and then sit back down and ask questions? This was the idea. I imagine that things would move around on shelves. Okay. So like those pieces, there's like 4 books on the shelf, they might, move around. Or if things totally move around, that would be okay too. I assume that people would try to put them back, and sometimes there'd be mistakes, they go in the wrong place, but not just like you wouldn't write on a library book, not actually writing on it.
And in any case, if it happens that way, you would have a record photographed so that you could put them back in the proper order if that was an issue.
That's true. That's true.
I think that what people object to when they don't touch things is whatever is on my fingers, in some respect,
right. We'll get on there.
Will be a transformation of some sort.
Right.
That's the objection.
Yeah.
It's an interesting concept.
Well, big time galleries are very worried about you going to drop it and break it.
Well, exactly.
Right, which I'm okay with.
I was curious about what you said about copying violent, negative, horrific art. And I'm just wondering if in the process of taking it into yourself, are you not a transformer? Can you not in some way reshape, reinvent? I mean, I think that's sometimes what art is supposed to do, to take what has started as something.
Sure, but imagine if it's something violent enough. Before the reinvention, you're still facing it.
Right.
And in my mind, there's a mimesis that happens immediately. I see it and I imagine it in my head immediately.
Right. Okay.
Right? And then we think about it and maybe have some kind of transformation. When I'm really talking about like the first moment of observation.
Okay, so then what is this doing to you? Is this eating you up?
I think it's eating all of us up. Yeah.
So will we all be turned into this?
I think if we only face it, if we only face it, and I think we have an idea that thinking about it or looking at it doesn't physically change us. And I think that it does, as if we're safe from it. Like, we could look at pictures of bombs and wars and body parts being flown apart, and it wouldn't, maybe it'll make us sad, but it's not really going to change us. And I think it is. And therefore, we would, in vision of our huge global future, also take a moment to look at something beautiful as a way to combat the me turning into something as ugly as what I'm looking at. Yeah.
And I'm thinking about Isabel, you know, what you said about how this somehow will shape her.
Right.
We've all been shaped by what we've seen in the course of our lives. And, you know,
so neuroscientists are telling us that somehow our children are chemically becoming the same as their parents, even if there's no genetic connection. If I adopt a kid and I have these thoughts, the chemical process that goes along in my mind will be recreated in this child. And I don't think that it's purely like psychological. I think it's a real physical thing that's happening.
So what do you need to do? I mean, other than just
realize it's happening. I just think, like, acknowledge that it's happening, so that you know, okay, if I'm going to look at that for X amount of minutes, I'm doing that much damage to myself. Not that we don't do it, but just that we're aware of it. And specific for Izzy, it was like, I will set aside the time, even if it doesn't seem important. Like, these big, horrible events in my life are very important. You know, looking at the grass might not be important, but it's beautiful. So it's sort of like elevating the mundane for the reason of health. These are just bubbling ideas in my mind.
Because I'm just becoming this
exactly.
thing.
No, NPR, right?
Yeah, I mean,
it's like now I have to give myself a time limit because I will not be well, and then I will give that to people, right? Hi, my love. Hi, my love. Did you get to touch something?
Too.
Right.
I used to be a redhead.
Really? Oh my gosh. Hey, do y'all want to sit back down and you can ask questions? I would love for you to sew on my thing. So yeah, there's a needle there. That's like the one sort of dangerous thing. I was like, oh, should I leave the needle there?
That's so tempting.
Okay, so somebody asked me a good question who has a cold, and so I'm going to ask her a question for her. So she asked, how did you stretch your canvas? So it's paper, right? And it's really heavy watercolor paper, hey Neil. Do you want to hold it, sweetie pie? So the paper has to soak in the water, so it's really big. So I put it right in the bathtub, right, Izzy? Izzy helps me with this. And depending on the weight of the paper, you soak it for longer or shorter. So if you soak it for too long, it disintegrates. If you don't soak it for long enough, it's not pliable enough to stretch.
So how long?
So this is the heaviest weight paper that I can find, and I soak it for a half an hour. And then I stretch it over stretcher bars like you would stretch a canvas, but the wood is, can I show them, sweetie? Is doubled up. So it's 2 layers of wood, and the corners are done so that the wood crisscrosses itself. So it's basically made to be extra strong, because when the paper dries, it will break the wood. So when it dries, it has to be clamped in all 4 corners so that it can dry nice and flat and it won't warp the wood. And then once it's dried flat, it stays flat. And the nice thing is you can get it wet, so you can work water media, and the paper will kind of dip in the middle, and then it will dry and it'll dry flat again. So I was constantly wanting to paint and draw and sew, and I needed a media that would do all of that. And so I came up with this. So anybody can do it. Yeah.
Can you tell me about the papers and the colors? Have you made the papers?
Yes. So I got really interested in paper making in Texas, and my colleague and I built a paper making studio almost from scratch. And so this is all handmade paper. This is handmade paper. This is handmade paper. So anything that has like a little bit of a texture is probably handmade paper. And then most of the handmade paper has been naturally colored. So this yellow is the yellow of turmeric, which I always say wrong. This black is the black of used cotton black t-shirts. So everything is either recycled material or the color of the fiber. So we used palm trees, banana trees, everything that was native in South Texas, where the studio was. And I'm trying to build my own paper making studio again here in Western Mass. It will happen. Yeah. Oh, so paper making came out of Texas, and basically my my ceramicist colleague said there's this thing called the Critter, and it comes out of New Zealand. It's $2,500, and it mashes up fiber, and we can make paper out of it. And I had no understanding of paper making at all, and I wrote a grant because I'm good at that, and we got this thing from New Zealand, and I was like, what do we do with it? And we cut down a bunch of palm trees, and we cooked them for days, and we mashed them up, and that was our first paper making experiment, and I just fell in love. And then I went to a place called the Women's Studio Workshop. Anyone who's interested in paper should look them up. They're in Rochester, New York, I think. No, not Rochester. They're near Poughkeepsie. Kingston, New York, I think. In that area, right? Anyway, they are like paper making experts. So I went there. I wrote a grant and went there for a week, and I did nothing but paper making with them. But most of it was just trial and error, and I just totally fell in love. And now I really want to go to some paper making places in Italy and see how they've been doing it for longer than me and learn more about it. Yes.
If people take down your stuff and then look at it and put it back, it's not the same.
Right.
Is that okay?
Yes, that's totally okay. Yeah, one of the things that I loved about the American Academy in Rome Library is that the putting back sort of shifted things, and you have evidence of people touching it and moving it a little bit and rearranging it, and yeah, I like that. Especially the shelves with the books, I figured would get put back in different orders, and that would be really nice. Yes? So I have vague names for these ones here. 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5 are all about the experience of not being able to see. So in my mind, they're called blindness. So blindness in the dark, when you're walking in the woods in the dark, or blindness when you're in a land of mist or fog or smoke or really, really bright light. And then the long horizontal ones are homes. So all of those are places that I've lived. So those have names. And then these fabric ones, this is philosophy. This is doors. This is my baby blanket. And that long one is rain. So I don't actually name them, I don't put them down on cards and sort of, but in my mind they continue with those names. That piece in the top right corner was my grandfather's. So the library also kind of gave me the ability to put not just my drawings and paintings, but objects that I hold dear. So that was my grandfather's print from Thailand. My dad was born in Bangkok, and his dad was a cultural attaché, and my granddad was really interested in art. And some of my earliest art memories were drawing elephants that he had in his house. So my parents let me have that. And that's my granddad, that black and white photograph is my granddad. So there's all these little elements of my family. This, since Robin's here, is my neighbor's, Robin, and she was kind of cleaning out her garage, and I'm really interested in measuring instruments. My husband is a cartographer. He's constantly measuring and, So anyway, this thing, is my neighbor. So I like sort of collecting all these things that are, have to do with my everyday life, family members and such. This thing over here, I could tell endless stories about these things, and you can stop me when we get out of time. But this thing over here is a block that was my husband's for at least a decade, and he used it to put a jack on there to jack up his truck. And when I met him, I basically stole it, and he was like, "Oh, that's a really important piece of wood." And I said, "Well, could it be a really important piece of artwork?" And so this became our collaborative piece. This is what's actually on the invitation card. On the back it says "to measure," because Dale is always measuring, and it's a little pocket, and this little piece of paper comes out. So I love the idea of pockets and measuring and books and collections of measuring ideas. And this is watercolor paper that was dremeled into. And this little shelf way up here that has a piece of glass, did anyone see what it is from up top? So it's my dog's baby teeth in there. So for instance, in my undergrad institution, Diego's teeth. It would totally not be cool to keep your dog's baby teeth. I would definitely be told, this is silly and ridiculous and not professional and unimportant, and I would be made fun of. It was a very macho environment. So this is kind of an act of bravery for me because, those teeth are really important to me. Why would I not have them in my library? Diego is the love of my life, and those are her baby teeth, and I always have them with me, so why not keep them in my library of important things? So that's something. Over here in this, in my bookshelf is these watercolor drawings, and I did these while I was pregnant with Izzy, so they say 36 weeks, 37 and a half weeks. This is my in labor drawing. It actually has 10:44, 10:48, 10:54, 11:09, 11:15. These are my contractions. So this, for instance, would not be cool in the land that I grew up in. So there's all these little things that are very important to me about this exhibition that I put in that I would not put on the wall in an uptown gallery in New York City, But I think that they're really important. Also, watercolor painting, totally uncool where I came from. Unacceptable, not real painting. Yeah.
So the piece that's horizontal, kind of in the middle there,
Yeah.
looks like a map. Is that a collaboration with your husband, the cartographer?
No, but I'm definitely influenced by all of his maps. You'd ask. Yeah, I'm definitely influenced by his maps, but that one is not a collaboration. That is the city of Sevastopol, where I lived, and it's a pretty in a way, it's an accurate map of, and it has a little key on the corner that says where I lived and where I worked and the street that I took and the bus I took home and all that kind of stuff. So, and there are pieces of maps.
They can find you because you have it all listed.
Yes.
It's like finding the book.
Yes. There are pieces of maps, and he probably brought home some of those pieces of maps, but he didn't touch that one. This one? This is maybe my favorite one. This is Naples, and I lived in Napoli for a while, and I learned Italian in Napoli, and I did an archaeological dig in Pompeii, which is just south of Napoli. And every time I go to Italy, I visit. And Napoli is this incredibly rich and beautiful and difficult place. It holds a dear place in my heart. So this is Vesuvius, and this is the city. So, Napoli. Yes?
Can you talk about that painting that looks landscape oriented in the left-hand corner?
Yes. So this is a painting of Pelham, which is where I grew up, from the studio above my garage in the springtime. And a lot of my paintings got painted over and changed. This is the oldest piece in the show. And this one I have always kept with me. So kind of wherever I go, I'm just like throw that in the car. You know, I've moved a lot. So this thing has moved with me. And yeah, it's kind of like hung with me through time, and it feels totally like Pelham to me. It's oil. It's oil paint on drop cloth.
Is that one of the only observed?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So is that the only observed work from direct observation? So I like working from direct observation more than anything, and because I was living in South Texas for the past 4 years, I was not working from direct observation, both because I didn't like the landscape and because it is inhospitable. So the world, it's too hot, it's too dry, it's just awful. But this is from direct observation, and this is, that's the Gulf, which I saw often. This is from direct observation. That's my studio chair that I'm sitting on. And then the works that do not look like they're from direct observation are from direct observation in my mind, if that makes sense. In other words, I'm not saying like, let's make up something. I'm looking at something very closely in my mind and trying to be as faithful as possible to it. So my whole history of artwork has always been from direct observation. And one of the reasons I'm so happy to come back is so that I can paint the landscape again, which is probably like my first love, drawing trees. This is a photograph that John Berger's son sent me of the sky at John Berger's funeral, which happened just recently, and I wasn't able to go. And John Berger and I were writing a chapter about trying to draw things that are immeasurable from direct observation. So clouds were one thing that we decided were totally immeasurable. And no matter how hard you try to draw the clouds, you can't do it. And he had told me to draw stream water, so I'm really interested in stream water, and we were both looking at smoke and mist. So this is, to me, like direct observation, because it's a moment of being in smoke. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Could you say more about that process of drawing from direct observation when there isn't something there to see outside yourself?
Yeah, I don't know what to say other than it's difficult. It's really difficult. I mean, I guess I'm making a difference between making stuff up as you go along, like drawing in a way where I'm responding to the painting. Like I would, make a couple of marks and then say, oh, this marks make me want to do this, make me want to do that, and sort of letting it go wherever it wants to go, as opposed to being pretty faithful to what I'm trying to see in my mind. So
That does make a big difference, yes.
right, in my process, it makes a big difference. And I often try to be imaginative like that, and I come back to like, no, I'm trying to look at that thing. I think I'm always really trying to look at that thing. Yeah.
What sense are you using to observe that? Like, if it's
Like, is it just vision?
Is it visual? Or
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think probably that all of our senses are mashed up and connected, and we have divided them up with words. And that probably when I'm, kind of closing my eyes and imagining being in that place, I'm definitely thinking about tactile things, and definitely remembering smells. I'm definitely remembering sounds big time. So I think probably all the senses are actually always intertwined, and we are separating them by using words to separate them. But I'm probably thinking of all those things at once. I'd say especially sounds. And I've got an audio recorder, something that I didn't get finished enough for this, but I've started to record the sounds of all my homes. So I have sounds of Rome and sounds of Naples and sounds of Pelham, but I haven't figured out a way to let the audience hear it in a way that pleases me. So that's kind of in the works. And smells is a big one, but I don't know how to capture that either just yet. Yeah.
difference between observing something firsthand
Yeah.
and then observing something that you copied in your mind. Like you said. Yeah.
What's the difference in my process? I don't think there's a lot of difference in my process at this point. It feels like the same thing to me. I don't know if that's satisfactory.
It feels like there's part of it that if the internal visual isn't stabilized, so if you're working on a piece of art over time, if it's not a stabilized image, if it changes as a source material,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yeah, okay, so he said, correct me if I'm wrong, he said, if you're working from your memory, it seems like the memory that you have in your head would not be stable. It would be changing. So you're working from this thing which is changing, as opposed to standing in front of the thing. Say I'm standing in Naples, looking at Naples, that thing would be, in theory, static. So part of my research in quantum art is looking into the idea that the world that we live in is not static and not certain. And this is in my mind so heavily that when I'm drawing, standing in place and looking at something, it's wildly uncertain. I feel like I'm seeing something that is absolutely not static. And if anyone is a real drawing from observation person, you'll know that you're drawing a thing and it's like changing and it's changing and it's changing and you're thinking, I've got it, and then you look up and it looks different. And you think you've got it and you look up and it looks different. And maybe you think I'm not a good drawer, and maybe we do need to keep drawing, but also the world is changing. So in my mind, when I'm working from direct observation, I'm working with a wildly erratic world, which is constantly changing. Probably my memory is a little more static than the world when I'm standing in it. I would much rather stand in it and draw it. That's my most favorite thing to do. But when I'm stuck inside, I work from my imagination. So we're almost out of time. Does anyone have one last question? Yes?
An observation, which is even when we're drawing from observation, we're drawing from memory. Just time delays just show that.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Okay, so that's beautiful. So even when we're drawing from direct observation, we're drawing from memory, the time delay is just shorter. And on top of that, I also think we're drawing not just from memory, but from our memory of the future. So in other words, in my mind, there's no reason why we remember the past and not the future. We could call it imagination, but in my mind, we're observing both forward and backwards. So I've got the delay of the forward and the backward and what's happening right there. And all that sounds like hooey craziness, but when you're actually trying to observe what's happening in front of you, I promise it's happening. You're imagining what it's going to look like tomorrow, and you're remembering what it looked like 2 seconds ago and 5 minutes ago, and especially if you work on something for hours and days, that's what's happening. Thank you, Paul. All right, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.